90's gamers of Reddit, what was the problem about it back then that modern gamers won't understand? This brings back memories of me buying Wall Street Kid for NES. The box art had what I thought was a spy who made money stealing top-secret information. In reality, it was a text-based stock market sim. Well played. Edit, adding link to box art for those that are curious how my 10-year-old brain was duped. One of the King's Quest games has this. There's a puzzle where you're supposed to figure out what to do with a little stick of dynamite before it blows up and kills you, except that the timer is based on your CPU speed, and even though the game is available on Steam today, it was never patched to fix this issue for much faster modern computers. So basically the dynamite blows up and kills you literally in the same second your character picks it up. I played through it again a few years ago and had to download a CPU limiter to get past that puzzle. I remember going back to SimCity 2000 many years later. I set it to the highest speed, as I tended to do back in the day, and then suddenly I was stuck because as soon as I closed the end-of-year report, the next year's would pop up instantly. I couldn't change the speed while it was open, so the game became unplayable. When my nerdiest friend finally got a Pentium 3 and a graphics card and a jacked copy of Descent, hours and hours of getting high and watching him troubleshoot all the necessary drivers and components, without internet, in DOS, and then finally, around 4:30 a.m., having the game loaded and ready and both of us stoned out of our minds in awe of the full 3D all-axis rotation of that game. I remember renting this really shitty football game on the NES when I was about 8 or 9 years old. In the tournament mode, after every win it gave you a 20-character password. I noticed after writing them down like 5-6 times that there was a pattern. Something simple like the numbers went up by 2, like from 2 to 4, and the letters went down by like 2 spots alphabetically, like from D to B. After some deciphering, I tried entering my new hacked code and it worked. I figured out how to instantly jump to the finals. I felt like a fucking genius that day. Haha. The codec frequency should be on the back of the box. I spent ages in MGS as a kid trying to examine the disk item in game before a friend at school told me it was on the physical game case he had lent me. When I rented the game from Blockbuster, a staff member had written it on paper and slid it behind the plastic sheath. Bless that person. Can't believe no one has yet mentioned losing the copy protection method or some component of it. I remember SimCity came with a book list with scrambled text that was only readable through a set of red filtered glasses they gave you. Or what's the third word on this fourth paragraph, page 36 of the manual? Anecdote. In 1992 I bought the Star Trek computer adventure game. It was similar to Sierra games of the day. It came on 5.25 inches floppy disks. I don't remember how many, but it was a big game for the time, so it was several disks. Long story short, after several hours of trying I couldn't get the game to install onto my 386SX25 MHz PC. I ended up calling their tech support and spoke to a guy on the phone. He was technically knowledgeable and judging by his accent he was in the same country that I was. He determined that one of my floppy disks must be faulty. He was going to replace the entire game for me, but in order to do that, he needed me to cut the first disc in half with scissors and mail it to them in an envelope. This would apparently prove that I was legit and not just trying to scam a free copy of the game. I did that, and a couple of weeks later I had a new copy of the game in the mail. It worked fine this time. So, in 1992, actually useful customer service from a game company, although it was slow and convoluted as hell. These days I would have just refunded the game to my Steam wallet without a second thought, even though I had to use the postal service and wait for weeks in 1992. I can't imagine trying to fuck around with a game company's phone support these days. It would be a nightmare, if it were even possible at all. Mucking with DOS memory management to make the game work. Pirating stuff was the norm. The worst thing malware could do was to sneakily encrypt your hard disk, one half, but its author only wrote it to flex his programming skills, not to hold your data hostage or thwart the enemy's nuclear weapons program. getting stuck in dark forests and literally can't play some other titles because you have a monochrome monitor. Anything above 320x240 with high frame rates were a pipe dream. In 3D games, loading UNIV and editing Duke 3D's config file to play the game in 512x384, which looked like 640x480 on our monochrome 14' monitor, but could reach a stable 15 FPS on a 5x86 with 16 MB RAM, getting the best upgrades you can get with your allowance, and the game is still slow, raging when the dreaded "this program requires Microsoft Windows" message appears. Despair upon the realization that Windows 95 will be required to play the newest and hottest titles, and your current PC is already obsolete. Downloading newer video drivers was a must to get fast 320x240 modes and directs. Getting my PS1 chipped and having a big list of games that my mom would have me pick through so she could buy them off the dodgy guy. Thinking about it now though, people dealing with chipping PS1 and games were probably nerds, but I thought it was dodgy AF when I was young. While in the Navy, late 90s, we pulled into Port Jebel Ali. They had a bunch of tents set up selling various goods. Anyways, in one of those tents, this guy had knock-off PlayStations, preloaded with every single game ever made at the time, around $80. We all chipped in and bought one. It wouldn't play the American disc games unless we left the lid open, lol. It had a bunch of Japanese games on it, games the States would never see. Fighting, racing, fantasy. Very hard to play without knowing the Japanese language. That console kept us busy, mainly Twisted Metal and Tekken. Swapping disks, hours spent messing with load order and config.sys and autoexec.bat to tweak every last byte of extended and expanded RAM in the boot sequence. IRQs, cokes, dummy loads and 10-base networking. No walkthroughs. Finding and downloading game demos at 2400 baud from OBBS. 110 was my best plausible speed. 150 was kind of the cutoff for this just isn't worth trying. The sheer inconsistency was the real head fuck. Kids have no idea these days. Games just deciding randomly to teleport you backwards to where you were 10 seconds ago, or you empty a clip into some dude who stands there doing nothing, and then the game world updates and suddenly he isn't and never was standing there. Or, the worst, jumping behind cover, feeling safe for a moment, and then suddenly dying because the game decides you died before you got into cover. My dad sprung for an ISDN line in the mid-90s. I remember being called a low-paying bastard in the chat when I played Quake Team Fortress and I was getting 100 ms to everyone else's 300 ms. My favorite strat was to lob an hallucinogen grenade into the enemy team's spawn room and cap the flag before they stopped lagging. 13-year-old me thought that was hilarious. That your knockoff copy of Crash Bandicoot you bought for £1 off the market won't work in your chipped PlayStation, or that there isn't enough space on the living room floor to spread the star map out for Frontier. Elite 2, having to smash a game in one full weekend as it had to go back to Blockbuster on Sunday night. Early on you had to edit some files on your computer and reboot it to make the sound or graphics work or to manipulate how the memory was set up. Some games required different settings and might straight up not work with the wrong setting, and it was a huge pain in the ass that I'm so glad we're done with. https://networkencyclopedia.com/configsys/ https://n.wikipedia.org/wiki/autoexec.bat. I also remember having to mess around in the BIOS settings much more than today. I don't think I've ever visited the BIOS screen on my current computer. The original pay-to-win. I've played a few arcade games on emulators in recent years and it's so obvious they're designed that way. Both The Simpsons Beat 'em Up and Turtles in Time have a second boss with way too much HP and deals crazy damage to you. First one is easy enough, but that second level is meant to be the end of the game if you don't pay more money. I remember playing the original Legend of Zelda. That game is hard as fuck. I've played other NES games through emulators in Switch Online eShop, Sega games, hard as fuck. Nintendo, hard as fuck. Hell, growing up and playing PS2 and Xbox games were difficult. These days if you get frustrated enough, by the time you start searching for a walkthrough, not only has someone already complete most of what you're playing, but also posted and wrote a detailed walkthrough. Old school games are hard. Some didn't have maps, saves, difficulty levels, or lives. I played this and Zelda 2 for years as a kid. I didn't beat Zelda 2 until I was 16. I bought it for myself for my birthday, dusted off the NES, and got to work. I didn't beat The Legend of Zelda until I was in my 20s. But I remembered all the secret bomb and candle spots. Edit. For context, when I was 16 the only way to get a copy of Zelda 2 that I had access to was to order it by filling out the form in a catalog and mailing it in, then waiting for weeks. This was in the mid-90s. So funny because you can tell how things like this are important to people who went through that. My brother still games fairly regularly and is always trying to get me to get a new system and join the fun. Anytime he's talking about his new system, or the new game or whatever, he points out, dude, like zero load time, literally less than 5 seconds and you're playing. 2 seconds, maybe. And I'm like shit, the future is now. Well, the believability of the graphics. Every new generation of consoles broke that reality of realism, but in the 90s that shit looked real good. Obviously the side-scroller games like Rayman and Commander Keen were cartoony, but games like Star Wars Jedi Knight Dark Forces, 007 GoldenEye, Star Wars Pod Racer, Lost, Ocarina of Time, and Tony Hawk Pro Skater captivated us with its 3D graphics. In some way we knew they could eventually get better, but it was near impossible to imagine until a new console came out and defy what had come before. An added bonus was getting a pretty dope game Chick's Quest in our cereal box. Sometimes, some cereal companies would just slap a full-ass games in the cereal box. That was dope. Seeing Mario 64 for the first time had my jaw hit the floor. It was so in advance of everything graphically that came before it. A true eye-popping moment in time. Only ever happened 3 times in my gaming life. 1984, Night Lore on the ZX Spectrum was in a computer store at the time when they loaded it. Within 15 seconds there was a crowd about 10 deep surrounding the specky Ocarina. Release day. Had been playing it since 5 p.m. and it was new 4 a.m. Just completed the first dungeon, left Kokiri Forest and went out into Hyrule Field. All of a sudden the colors started changing and a beautiful sunset lit up the TV. It's the single most beautiful moment I've ever witnessed in a game. It wasn't popular, Luke, it was popular, but it was popular for nerds and children. There was still a huge stigma with gaming and being another. Even among kids, the ones who played video games were seen as dweebs and less popular than the athletic kids. Now, a kid I went to high school with that was an athlete made $50 million streaming video games. I remember not really being open at all about being a gamer in middle school, 6th grade, 1991. In elementary school, 1-5, it was fine to discuss video games, but once 6th grade came along it seemed to bring a kiddie stigma to gaming and was definitely the nerdy, dorky clique to be in, especially from a girl's viewpoint. But then in 1992, Mortal Kombat came out and all of that changed in my area. I was in 7th grade and everyone was talking video games. Just about every kid found out that any kid was passably a gamer and had just kept quiet about it for a couple of years. There was a Sega crew and a Nintendo crew and even some TurboGrafx kids. PC guys were always a notch above, but we all could talk gaming for hours on end. It was amazing and changed my world big time. Found a lot of new friends and also found out that some people in the jock or cool kids clique were also into music like Metallica, Rage Against the Machine, and not just jumping on the Nirvana grunge trend. Sorry, took a trip down memory lane with that one. Thanks for this comment though. Yeah, you know, I'm kind of surprised at how much this particular detail has been lost to the ages. Reddit. I am here to tell you, if you're a kid in school from, say, 1985 to 1995, and you admitted you played computer games at all, you were made fun of. Computers were for nerds and weebs and losers. At my school it was a secret society of gamers. You never talked about gaming in earshot of anyone else, just the other fellow nerds that you knew were into it, exchanging discs, boxes, and manuals covertly like we were buying drugs. Me and my dad got stuck on the last level of Jurassic Park for Sega Genesis. The raptors were attacking you and the only way to beat them was to shoot the T-Rex skeleton and have it fall on them. We did not figure this out on our own. My dad started calling people until he found someone either at Sega or the game company who told us the secret. There was no internet to look it up. In the really early 90s, maybe late 80s, you'd occasionally get a cassette tape of games from friends and no way to know what games were on there, or where they started, or even what they were about and how to interact with them. You'd diligently load each game and then make a note of the counter where it finished loading. Then you'd randomly press keys to work out what did what, and what the point of the game was. Price drops weren't as big and as frequent as today. That's why you took your time picking up a game, as it had to last you months. Unlike these days where games can be so cheap, people end up with huge backlogs of unplayed games. Also, depending on the year and if you had a computer with access to the internet, you couldn't just go online and found a complete guide or walkthrough video completely free, so getting stuck in a game was definitely a thing. Fast-forward bit and multiplayer PC games would get patches, but it wasn't the automatic update like it is today. You'd need to make sure you were running the same version as your buddies to join the server that they're in. And this was when you had 256K DSL, so it took a while to find, download, and install the patch. Specifically Battlefield 1942 comes to mind. I know I'm a decade older than this, but in the early 80s I needed to learn how to run DOS in order to play games. When I was 4 years old I had to teach it to myself. I remember it being really hard and spending night after night learning DOS before I could manage to play with my Christmas present, my very first computer. Then later, when I got my Commodore 64, you didn't need to learn DOS, but still had quite a learning curve just to be able to play games. But it was worth it because you could play YR Kung Fu, Imagine, Konami, 1986 and Archon, Electronic Arts, 1983. Yeah, but it made you feel like an elite hacker, just knowing a dozen commands in DOS or editing basic CFG and BAT files. Haha. Commodore 64 was like living in the future. It was cutting-edge tech, but by the year 2K a calculator could blow it away in computational power. Lol. Man, we were lucky to grow up in that era. The rise of PCs, proliferation of cell phones, and the explosive growth of the World Wide Web from crappy bulletin boards to the current internet. It's wild. One issue that's maybe taken for granted today is how to connect your gaming console in a way that you can play it. Many TVs didn't have audio-video cable lines, and consoles required it. Usually you'd have to go out of your way to purchase an adapter or sometimes two adapters. One to allow for a coaxial in the first place. It had like these two fork prongs that had to be screwed in, with the screwdriver, onto the TV. Then you could take that adapter and connect it to your adapter for the console. If you had a console and no coaxial adapter, and had to use the audio and video cables, then you'd have to come up with interesting ways to connect it, such as connecting it to the VCR, if you had one, and then turning on the TV, changing it to the VCR channel, then selecting that it's a V line. I think, looking back compared to today, it's a lot of effort compared to just HDMI and go. Speaking of wires, there was no wireless. You had to sit within 5-ish feet of the console, like, right up in front of the TV, and usually that would mean sitting on the carpet, on the floor between the coffee table and the TV itself. Your miles obviously vary depending on location and parents, etc. But just giving an idea of the impact of wireless and how big of a deal that really was. When gameplay speed was based on CPU speed, a fast computer might be too fast to play a game. We had a turbo button on our Gateway 486 that let you swap to a lower CPU speed to make certain DOS games playable.